Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war update, Frontline update for the 11th of March 2023. Let's get straight to the northeastern sector, the axis going from Kupiansk down to Svatova to Kremina. Again, a relatively quiet or very quiet day on the front there. Not much to report at all. If we go to the ISW, they say of this area, limited ground attacks from Svatova to Kremina line. Ukrainian General Staff did not report ground attacks in the Kupiansk or Liman directions on yesterday, a notable deviation from its normal reporting pattern. So that indicates that it really is quiet. A Western military district soldier claimed a Russian soldier claimed in an interview published on March 9th that Russian forces took control of important heights near Makivka, but ISW has not observed any visual confirmation of this. A video published on March 9th purportedly shows Luhansk People's Republic LPR Second Army Corps soldiers digging trenches near Kremina. So they are certainly posturing in a defensive manner around Kremina, while supposedly on their offensive, it just doesn't seem to be mounting to much. There, perhaps Russians have made, well, at least they are claiming they've made some gains on some important heights near Makivka, which is just there, as the ISW reports. It goes on to say another mill blogger claimed that unspecified elements of the bars, so those are reserves of the Cascade unit and an airborne forces VDV unit, possibly of the 76th Airborne Division, destroyed a squad of Ukrainian soldiers attempting to conduct a reconnaissance operation near Kremina. A mill blogger praised Deputy Chief of Staff of the VDV Major General Alexei Naumets, who purportedly commands Russian forces on the Svatova-Kremina line, claiming that Naumets is competent at making advances, while an unnamed commander, presumably EMD Commander Colonel General Rustam Muradov, senselessly loses Russian armor in Vuhledar. Okay, which is to say that the mill bloggers, the sort of nationalistic pro-Russian voices in the internet community seem to think that things are going fairly competently well, as in there is competent Russian leadership in the Svatova to Kremina line. Up here, they are making perhaps slow but competent advances in the Kremina area. Down in Vuhledar, though, things are very different, and they are very critical, as they have been for some time since November, of the decisions being made in the Vuhledar area and that which has been taking place there. So, it could be that there are signs that the Russians are doing a better job around Kremina. However, there are also signs that they really haven't made much progress at all as well. And it gets back onto this conversation as to what is this the Russian offensive, the big Russian offensive? Is this all they can muster? Because now we're going into the mud season. There will be conditions that inhibit movements, quick movements. That will inhibit offensives. This is not the time to be doing an offensive. So that hard ground of the winter has now passed. That was the Russian offensive time. One was led to believe. What is going on? Is this the most they can muster? But otherwise, going back to reports on what's going on frontline, you go to Defmon, no reports, Suryat maps, Rebar. No one mentions anything or until you get down to Bakhmut. There really is nothing much going on, it seems. So I'll move on past that but it is interesting that VDV are being mentioned a lot in the Kremlin area. That is an indication, as the ISW say, that they are prioritizing that area for quality assaults, and yet there may be marginal gains for the Russians in the forest area, but really not a lot to report on there. So then we come down to Pashpirna, Berestova, Bilorivka up there, and Bilorivka down here. And we have this really, I mean, it's considerably larger now, isn't it, than it was before when we were talking about this as being the front line some weeks ago. And now there's all this land here that is under the control of the Russians, but it has been at quite some cost to them. Now, I want to point you towards a fantastic interview, Michael Kaufman interview on on a podcast. Let's find that for you. Here, Shashank Joshi of The Economist highlighted it. It's the Geopolitics Decanted podcast. Michael Kaufman reflects on his time that he's just spent in Bakhmut. So he's just got back from Bakhmut. Kaufman is just well worth following anyway, and a great sort of writer on all things to do with the Ukraine war. My summaries of what he says, which are pertinent to this sort of frontline. Let's give you the map, which is pertinent to this frontline situation. So the key takeaways, I'm just going to kind of list them. Starlink are super important. Everyone uses them. They're a game changer. There aren't any other systems that particularly seem to be used. Starlink really are super important. Reconstitution is an issue. So going forces are somewhat degraded. Then when you are reconstituting them with reinforcements, they're generally going to be mobilized or less competent troops, less well-trained troops, and that is an issue. Reconstituting forces is an issue. It's also force quality as a whole is a huge issue as far as Kaufman is concerned. The mobilized, the training that they're given abroad, it's great that they're being given that, but it's still not the same as having well-seasoned, well-trained troops over a long period of time. And indeed, most of those troops, troops from the beginning of the war are now lost. Killed or casualties in some way, and that is a huge issue, and it really affects force quality. Obviously, that's the same for both sides, but looking from the Ukrainian point of view, they have lost a lot of really good, well-trained troops. The leadership is ossified at the top, Soviet-style leadership at the top, but down at the bottom, it's much more dynamic. But there is a big difference there, and there still is some big decision-making that gets done at the top, which is kind of Soviet-era leadership. They need a whole load of mechanization for an offensive, like IFVs, a load of stuff, but a lot of mine clearing. I'm going to talk about that later. Breaching equipment, they just will need loads more of that because Russians have mined everywhere. It's all about air defense capability and artillery ammunition. So you're seeing a lot about this. This is the same as it reported in news. News has got this right, is air defense capabilities and artillery ammunition. Russians are adaptive on the ground. This is around Bakhmut. You can't generalize on the whole war with what's going on in certain areas. So Bakhmut is not representative of what's going on elsewhere. However, there it seems like the Russians do have an artillery advantage at the moment. We heard earlier that there was a parity of artillery, but I think more recently there's been an uptick in both aircraft and artillery advantage for the Russians, and this might feed into the claim that, and you're hearing this from Russians themselves, that the artillery ammunition is being sent to Bakhmut at the expense of other places around. So Vuhledar, 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade are not getting ammunition. But it is because they claim it's all going to Bakhmut. Wagner themselves are very varied. There is adaptation going on. The Russians are adapting, this is according to the people on the ground in the Bakhmut area. So again, can't necessarily be generalized, but they are adapting to things in and around Bakhmut. The Wagner aren't just waves of human conscripts. There is that, but they also have other groups. So night attack with thermal imaging and all the great equipment, because Wagner are a very different thing from regular Russian army. You've got assault brigades and the more competent Wagner troops, as well as those other conscript waves. So they are more varied and don't just think in terms of waves of human cannon fodder. The Ukraine now has a much better ability to fix its own artillery, so it's sending its pieces, doesn't have to send everything to Poland now. It has some indigenous capability, which is really fantastic and is helping a lot. The counteroffensive that may come, I know this isn't necessarily to Bakhmut, that will come, may well be slower and more about pressing. It might be a disappointment, at least at the beginning, to many people. You've got an awful lot of mines and defensive entrenchments that they're going to have to navigate. You're going to have it will be careful and a lot slower, and we'll need a lot of breaching equipment like these armored engineering vehicles to get rid of mines, so on and so forth. So much to gain in knowledge from that one podcast. I point you towards it, Geopolitics Decanted by Silverado, and let's get now back to Bakhmut itself. So just a few insights there. There's movement going north. Some, like reporting from Ukraine, are claiming that there's been counterattacks near Kromova, and in fact, Ukraine have pushed the Russians back there. I haven't seen any other verification of that. There does seem to be success for the Ukrainians around this M03 road, the E40 here coming down, that they've pushed further to the northwest there. They are very close to Orikovo Vasilivka, and definitely Dubovo Vasilivka has been taken, and in fact they've pushed on westwards of there. Now, interestingly, Suryak Maps, who's a pro-Russian mapper, has some gains here along the road I was just talking about. Ukrainians are pushing back from Vasyukivka here. There's some fighting there. So they say that situation north of Bakhmut, the Russian army and DPR forces have begun advancing along the M03, close to Orikovo Vasilivka, while clashes with the Ukrainian army are increasing at the outskirts of Vasyukivka up here. But they don't actually talk. So this is interesting because no reports has this area having some gains for the Russians. Sorry, so no reports is a pro-Russian source saying, pro-Ukrainian source saying, in the north, Russian forces tried to bypass Kromova and directly attack Bodanivka. This is a continuation of yesterday's attacks. Fighting takes place in the northeastern side of Bodanivka. So they don't have this move along the road there, but do have gains here. So it's weird. They've got gains there. Suryak has gains here, and in fact, Deep State have gains here. So I'm assuming gains in both those places. No report says Ukrainian troops repelled the first attack. And that they're north of Solidar, the Ukrainians have repulsed an attack on Rozdalivka, and no information is available about renewed attacks when monitoring the situation. And then it sort of goes into Bakhmut itself. So before we get there, that's to say that Suryak Map says increases here, no report says increases here. One doesn't say the other, and the other doesn't say the other. So I'm assuming they are just making big gains to the northwest, and that land, I wouldn't say big, but it is incremental each day, and that is proving to be a big problem for the Ukrainians, because as you can see, this whole area here is now under Russian control, and Bakhmut looks small. The city of Bakhmut looks small as a result in comparison. Defmon says pretty similar things, that Russians are making forward gains in the northwestern direction. They are advancing. Heavy battles reported around Ivaniska, the airplane, and the Azon metal processing plant. So I'm going to get onto all of those, but I just want to get you to this, which is a closer look at the Bakhmut supply roads. There's still a few viable routes. Keep in mind that all these roads are actually dirt tracks in fields at best. So you have the northern and the southern roads in. This is looking from the west, are really under fire control, particularly in the north. Maybe not so much the south. Just not sure what's going on around this whole Ivaniska area as much, but it could be that the Russians have been pushed back, so maybe that has some more usability. But otherwise, there's a lot of footage of movement on mud roads, and as you've seen from my news report, the mud is very thick and difficult for maneuver. Okay. So this is what the ISW say. Geolocated footage posted on the 10th indicates that Russian forces have advanced to new positions in northwestern Bakhmut within 800 meters of the Azon metal processing plant. Actually, there's more claims that they go on. So new drone footage posted on the 10th shows Russian soldiers removing civilians from buildings in eastern Bakhmut to an unknown location at gunpoint, indicating that Russian forces are conducting clearing operations in eastern Bakhmut. So this is what liberation looks like, which is Russians taking Ukrainians out of their houses, effectively at gunpoint, and removing them. You could say that they are accompanying them and it's keeping them safe and so on. I'm sure there's different narratives for that. For the last 3 days, we've been watching how on the left bank of the Bakhmutivka River, the Russians began to gather civilians and take them out of the city. The further fate is unknown. The best things they have are backpacks from 3 to 10 people walking columns behind them, Russians with a machine gun. We counted more than 30 people. So there were different claims of maybe 4,000 people left in Bakhmut. It's amazing that people would remain there, but these are going to be your most vulnerable and elderly. Kaufman also talks about this in the podcast. He's just amazed that they are still there, some of these people. But the liberators want to remove them. And that's a difference. Ukrainians are leaving them there. You're free to decide what you want to do. If you want to stay there, we've got a battle going on here. Russians are like, right, we're going to take you out at gunpoint. I don't know what that tells you. I could guess. Now, this steel plant up here. So the ISW say they're within 800 meters of steel plant. At least that's what geolocated footage says. But then it goes on to say Russian mill bloggers widely claim that the Wagner Group forces entered the Azov metal processing plant complex in northwestern Bakhmut and are moving deeper into the plant. And in fact, there is some Ukrainian footage of someone walking along saying, we are now just on the way to take out some of these guys who are trying to get a foothold in the plant. The apparent focus on a Russian assault on the Azov industrial zone, a heavily built-up complex of multiple buildings, indicates the Russian forces are prioritizing a frontal assault on fortified positions in a tactically challenging industrial area instead of opting for a wider encirclement of western Bakhmut via attacks on Kromova. This assault will likely be very costly for the Wagner Group. Well, actually, it appears like they're probably doing both there, although they might have been pushed back a little bit from Kromova. Not sure. As I say, they are certainly succeeding further to the northwest. And north and south are the ways of getting around the problem of having the natural barrier of the river, although there are also claims that they are trying to get across the river as well. I'll come on to that. So claims about the Azov steel plant are there. We have Rebar pro-Russian source saying Wagner PMC assault groups have entered the territory of the metal processing plant from the north and are fighting in the industrial zone. The offensive is complicated by the density of buildings and a large number of underground utilities. It says Russian forces are evacuating civilians from the combat zone. So, as that's their narrative. Heavy fighting is taking place on the western bank of the river. The enemy positions are constantly being hit by artillery fire. So it is tough around there. Now, No Reports says Bakhmut Center, the situation is worrisome. Despite the river barrier, Russian troops in the north have managed to reach the industrial zone. Combat is fierce. Russian troops are also making progress in the south near the forest. Literally everything is thrown into battle by the Russians. Now, here, I actually already had this all under Russian control. So I don't think anything's changed there in the last 24 hours plus. Okay. However, he does have the Azov steel plant half under the control, and actually that's the guy I was talking about in the video. It says AFU soldier confirmed battles yesterday, but we have quite an area there under Russian control. Just trying to work out exactly what that is. Let's have a look. So just checking that actually what No Reports has here in that area taken by the Russians is actually just here. It's not in the plant. So he's got this grey zone being much further back. I've got Russian control there. So actually he doesn't have the Russians in there. I thought previously he had them in the steel plants. Steel plant is here. But he has that certainly a grey zone to some extent there. Things are difficult there. If we go back to ISW, they talk about Colonel Sehi Cheravati stating that the combat intensity in Bakhmut is very high and that Wagner troop has committed its main part to the fight, as No Report said, throwing everything at it, supporting ISW's assessment that Wagner has increasingly committed high-quality operators to offensives in Bakhmut. This also includes VDV elements. So this is, indeed, we've had Russian mill bloggers crowdfunding for VDV in the area, suggesting that they are there, and ISW talking about whether they are supplanting the Wagner group. Russian sources, including Yevgeny Prigozhin, in charge of Wagner, claim that Ukrainian forces appear to be preparing for a counter-offensive in the Bakhmut area. Just not sure whether that's happening, don't know what's going on, whether there's all sorts of psyops, so on and so forth. So if we go back to Syriac maps, they claim, where are you, Syriac maps? They claim there is some an attempt to gain a foothold. Here we go in to the west of the river in Bakhmut. So an exclusive, they say. Deep reconnaissance groups crossed Bakhmutivka River, trying to set a foothold between Borussia, Horbotova, and Torhova streets in the center of Bakhmut. Clashes continue with the Ukrainian army in the area of in the area as Russians haven't established full control yet, which is a problem. If they can actually cross that river and get a foothold in there, then that river is the river is breached and you've got a problem. So that is possibly happening somewhere around here on the east, on the west of the river. Things are difficult in Bakhmut, as you can well imagine. Now, one other thing of note is that the famous MiG-17 statue in Bakhmut no longer exists. It has been destroyed. I haven't got any confirmation as to who destroyed it, whether it was the Ukrainians on purpose not to give the Russians a sort of PR talking point, or whether it's the Russians themselves. I have no idea. No one seems to indicate that. But that is the famous statue taken out. That is in the south. And then other than that, so Defmon has to say, does he have anything else to say? No. So other than that, we're moving on to the south. It is just very, very difficult fighting, and we're starting to get into real, like in the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, but also the steelworks in Severodonetsk. We're looking to have similar fighting going on in Bakhmut. Whether we see a withdrawal again, I keep saying this every day, I don't know. Or are the Ukrainians going to put up more of a fight to defend Bakhmut? Moving down then from Bakhmut towards Avdiivka, we are coming past, as ever, Toretsk, New York, Sumy. There's fighting in the north here near Krasnohorivka, and in the south around the Opitny area. Usual sort of stuff going on there. Russian mill bloggers, says the ISW, claim that Russian troops attacked Ukrainian fortifications in Avdiivka and Shverny, and that Russian forces are continuing to fight in Mariinka. We'll come on to that in a second. So all the usual places are mentioned: Kamyanka, Severny, Pervomaisky, Vodyany, Nevelsky, Krasnohorivka. If we go to No Reports talks about Avdiivka looks rather similar to Bakhmut, attempts to encircle it from the north and south. Avdiivka, Russia has intensified its airstrikes on the city. This is in connection with a repetitive failure north of Opitny and Vodyany. Russian assault groups have major losses in this area. Around Novobakhmutivka, there are local battles. The AFU has repulsed an attack on Nevelska, which is down there. So that's that small settlement out in the countryside that sort of holds the key maybe to an encirclement to Pervomaisky and further down south as well. But also trying to do a lot of activity up north, and Defmon says pretty much the same thing. The Russians are focusing on enveloping Avdiivka from north and southwest. I believe most of the effort is being put into the south. Russian units have moved. Russia has moved units from the 114th Motorized Rifle Regiment and 136th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade to the Avdiivka area. That's supposed to be the brigade that's replacing the 155th and 40th Naval Infantry Brigades in Vuhledar. So I don't know what's going on there. When it comes to Rebar just talks about Mariinka, so not an awful lot of news about the explicit details of what's going on around there. Just battles going on still. Mariinka. Rebar, pro-Russian source, says in the center of Mariinka, Russian motorized riflemen managed to gain a foothold in the hulks of high-rise buildings on Druzhba Avenue. Nevertheless, the offensive is developing mainly at the expense of flank strikes to the north and south of the town. I don't know with the English there whether they got that wrong. That means developing at the expense of flank attacks means flank attacks are not going well as a result of work being done in the middle. I think what they really mean to say is that most of the damage is being done on these flank attacks. So attacks towards Pobyeda, down south in this area here, the Druzhba Avenue, and in the north there as well. And indeed north of the centre. I'm not quite sure exactly where Rebar's talking about with regards to the taller buildings that the Russians have some presence in, but of course there's quite a lot of uh, buildings that really aren't as tall as they once were. There's a lot of rubble in Mariinka, and it's a pretty terrible scene, all told. The ISW says, as I've already said, Russian forces are continuing to fight in Mariinka. One mill blogger claimed that Russian troops resumed attempts to storm Novo Mykolivka, which is, just to the south here. So no real explicit details again there. Novo Mykolivka, perhaps Russians trying to storm that again. This is a settlement they'd really like to take, because without that it's quite difficult to or it would certainly help take Vuhledar if they could approach Vuhledar from the northeast on this higher ground here. Then they would have a greater chance than trying to repetitively take it from the south, which they appear to be doing now. So ISW talks about the Russian mill bloggers claiming that Russian forces have resumed operations against Vuhledar on March the 10th, and talks about how they are significantly under strength and probably unable to make much headway there. No report says nothing. Defmon mentions the Ukrainians have repulsed attacks in the area of Mariinka, Pobyedo, Novo Mykolivka, and Vuhledar. Russians do not stop attacking Vuhledar, and that's it for this kind of area around here. Not too much detail, just that the Russians are attacking. Let's go and have a look at the rest of or Zaporizhia and Kherson, the rest of the front lines going to the southwest. With regard to the Dnipro River here and the area around Kherson, particularly these islands, there's quite a lot in the ISW daily report. Russian forces continue reconnaissance activity near the islands in the Dnipro River Delta. Ukrainian Southern Operational Command spokesperson Natalia Humenyuk stated on March 10th that Ukrainian forces destroyed 7 Russian naval vessels that attempted to reach the islands over the course of 3 recent unspecified days. Humenyuk stated that neither Russian nor Ukrainian forces control the islands, and that it would be dangerous for Ukrainian forces to establish permanent positions on the islands, because Russian forces could easily introduce forces from the east left bank at any time. A Russian mill blogger claimed on March 10th that Ukrainian forces continued to shell Russian forces operating near the Velyky Potemkin, Krylik, and Belorudi islands of Kherson city. So there is lots of operation going on there. I showed you some drone footage of Ukrainian drones taking out consistently boats moored around these islands. They are not military boats, but civilian boats that the supposedly Russian army have been using to navigate around the delta. So Ukrainians are taking those boats out of action, I presume for some kind of future activity, maybe landing on the islands, taking the islands. There is some footage I have seen of Russians shelling Ukrainian soldiers landing somewhere around here. So there is military activity as well as just sort of shelling and drone activity there. And moving just to the southwest or to the west, we have Kimburn Peninsula. I don't know how much this tells you. Reportedly, the occupied Kimburn Spit today seems like Russians are having an unpleasant day there. So there is artillery, artillery activity taking place on the peninsula. I gather that the Ukrainians are consistently hitting the Spit and all the peninsula with artillery. Now, there's routine artillery drills along the Zaporizhia front line. I know that there have been talks that I think Sloviansk was hit, maybe an ammunition depot in Sloviansk was hit by the Russians last night or over the last couple of days. So the Russians are obviously active as well as the Ukrainians being active. Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol again hit last night by Ukrainian missiles, HIMARS and or Vilka M. Probably the Vilka M for the longer range attacks on Berdyansk and Mariupol, but not 100% sure. Melitopol will be within HIMARS range. So that could be why there was a large number of troops, Russian troops, factored into being lost in the Ukraine figures released this morning. I'm not sure. Details yet to come out of those areas being hit. And still lots of reports of the Russians building defenses. In fact, building defenses quite far back from Frontline. Some commentators today saying they're building defenses in places that will never be involved in war. Like, as in, they're unlikely to be, full-on offensives going into those positions. If they do, it's all over by that stage anyway. So they really are going to town on building defenses. Anyway, that's today's Frontline update. Really appreciate your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you want to support the channel, all the ways you can do that are in the description below. Super kind of you if you do, but just hanging out and chatting respectfully is always the way forward. Anyway, take care. Speak later.